It is a buyer's market. And what that means is buyers have leverage right now. But as a buyer, you need to understand what that leverage is and what we're seeing in the market that buyers are requesting that is working and what is not working.
Yeah, so if you're if you're a buyer and you're in the buyer's market, homes might be overpriced, they might be sitting a little bit longer. So how can we use some of those factors to our advantage? If you're a buyer, you can be strategic about those. So we're going to talk about that today.
Yeah, strategic, but also remembering that it's a buyer's market, but it's not a crash. So there's a delicate balance between over asking and being realistic in what you're asking because you can get a lot of value right now, but if you ask for too much, you can get none, right? So there's this delicate balance depending on the situation.
Yeah, and I think definitely varies on your location. So work with your agent on what that looks like specific to your area. But whether it's price or inspection items, repairs, or even discount points, those are all things that you can negotiate that essentially boil down to the price with negotiating on that.
Yeah, so first let's talk about the price because I think that's the number one thing people want to negotiate on right now, and it's fair and you can.
Yeah. So one thing that we look at is, days on market. So if the house went on the market yesterday or even today, and you are thinking, oh, I'm going to lowball them, that seller is probably not mentally ready for that. So it's like, okay, maybe they're testing the waters. They're probably not going to look at an offer that's 20% below ask on, day one or day two on the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how I feel too. It's like, I have buyers that are looking for a really good deal right now. And I'm like, that's fine. But you have to wait till a house is on the market for 60 days before you submit a really low offer. I mean, we can submit it right away. And that's fine, but you just can't expect it's going to get taken on the first week it's on the market because, they're thinking they can sell their house for what they listed it for, right? But
Yep.
after it's been sitting, you like that's kind of the thing. If you want a deal right now, you have to be willing to sacrifice that this house might sell before that time comes.
Yeah, and if you're a buyer, it's easy to be like, okay, I saw that house, it's too much for me, or they're too high on price. But if you're a buyer that's looking for a deal, maybe you go on, your search engine site and you search for homes or you set that parameter where it's like homes that have been on the market for 2 months or longer or 1 month or longer. And you can kind of narrow it down. It's like, okay, they've done some price reductions or that seller hasn't yet. But you can kind of take into account those factors and you're going to have better results with some lower offers, especially on something that's been on the market a month or two.
And something else I like to look at for even homes that have just come out, I don't know if you look at this at all, but if they've owned it a long time and they have a ton of equity, sometimes I think it's worth it to take that shot too, even if the home just came out. Because what that tells me is they're possibly older and they might not
Mm-hmm.
care. They might just want to get rid of it. I had a seller that was very much like that. They came in first or second day we had it listed, offered like 15% below ask, and my seller is like, yeah, let's take it. I was like, really? We can definitely get more than this. No, I just want to take it. And so I
I
do
want it to be
think I want to be
done.
done. I don't care. I don't need the money. Essentially for him it was like a rental he had one of his employees in forever. You know what I mean? And she
Yeah.
was moving out to assisted care. So there are situations if they've owned it a long time, but if they've only owned it a few years, they have a little bit of equity. Like it's a weird situation that they would fire sell it, right away,
Yeah.
right? So you just have
Yeah.
to kind of look at that because if you make the low offer too early, it can ruin the deal later because whether you like it or not, the seller may be offended by your offer. And then you have this bad connotation around you, right? Where they're more open to it 2 months later when they haven't got any offers versus, day one or day two when they think they're going to sell their house for, this or more. Some sellers still think there's like bidding wars or something. So,
Yeah.
you do want to play your cards right. And really, like for me, like I'm looking for a deal in this market as well. And I'm letting everything sit for 60 days before I approach it, because I want a really good deal. And the chances of that happening, a weekend are just low.
Especially on the, investor side when you're looking not for a primary residence, but for, an investment.
Yeah.
And I think on the flip side, if somebody's looking for a primary residence, and I always encourage them to make an offer unless it's obscenely low. Sellers cannot say no to an offer they don't have. And once that seller gets an offer in their hand, they can accept it, reject it, or counteroffer. So if they reject it, okay, that's fine, we tried, but maybe that gets the ball rolling into a conversation. But like to your point, you don't want to insult them right out the gate, because then let's say, fast forward a month or two, they didn't take your original offer, but they still have that bad taste in their mouth, even though you're still a good buyer and a ready buyer. They'll be like, well, I don't want to sell it to them. They lowballed me. Even though it wasn't truly a lowball offer,
Yeah.
they were just out of touch on the list price.
Yeah, and the realtor doesn't always know. I've learned that too. Like I've talked to realtors before that said my seller is very, sticky on this price, and we submit a low price and it gets countered low or accepted. And even me, like even when I had that listing, like I had listed it for 2 days. I mean, if you would have asked me, is my seller going to take $257 on a $315,000 listing that was listed well to sell, by the way, I would have told you no. But he did.
Yeah.
So it's like, we don't always know either. Sometimes you have to present that to the seller and they surprise you.
Yeah. Which kind of makes it fun. So it's like there's a lot of information and data that goes into it, but it's also feeling and motivations. And if a seller is like, yep, time is more important than money to me, then great. Your buyer just won.
Yeah, and I think that the sellers right now have this urgency because they know, most of them know that the market is not a seller's market. So like I just had a situation where I had a listing and they did find some big issue and it was $10,000 off, right, for this big issue. And we probably could have negotiated that a little bit, but they were pretty dead set on the 10 grand or they were walking away. And I told my seller, I said, listen, we can relist it. I think we can get a little, I think this is going to be an issue, but I think that somebody else would maybe take 5 off instead of 10 and et cetera, et cetera. And she was like, no, like, let's get it sold. Cause I think they have already wrapped their head around selling it, but B, like there is this urgency that, yeah, it could sit for another 2 months though, if you don't take this buyer. So, these are the things. This is where the buyer has the power. It's not like you can just offer whatever you want, but the sellers are feeling the pressure and you're not, as the buyer, feeling that same pressure.
Yeah. And is 5,000 at the end of the day, if you're carrying it for another month or two, that 5,000 profit ultimately might end up being 2,000 or whatever it is. So is it really worth it? Like it's probably not really worth it.
It's probably not, but you never know, you got to like kind of be open because some sellers are like already feel like they're getting a good deal on it, or, they already had offered a slight discounted price on it. So, at the end of the day, it was closer to like probably 9,000 with the discount. Yeah. But to your point, like how long is it going to sit to make 9 grand? I mean, or are you going to have to lower your price? Because it's not like we had multiple offers. We had one, And
if they're looking at a house to purchase, like if they're selling and then needing to go to the next place, like, are you going to miss out on the place that you want, or
Yep.
that you need?
All of that happens, and I think that really, I'm going to skip down a little bit. Into it has to be the right house, right? And a house that was under contract that no longer is under contract is also a good house to offer a low offer on. A lower offer.
No, that makes sense. And we just had one of those where a house went under contract. I had a client watching it and it went back on the market. Well, we don't know what happened. They said it was to no fault of the house, so it wasn't like an inspection issue. It was something with that buyer, and sounds like they, let that buyer out of the contract. But now if you don't know, or if you don't talk to that agent to figure out why the house went on the market, some people immediately think, oh, that there must be something wrong with it, or oh, something must have came up in the inspection, where it was actually, an issue with that buyer, like their financing fell through or something. So sometimes you can get a better deal just for the fact that it was off the market and then went back on the market.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the second one is seller credits for rate buy downs. So this is a big one that, I was seeing it more last year than I am this year because rates were a little higher and the market was a little slower. But I'm still seeing this a little bit on the rate buy down.
Yeah, and I think it's a underused tool that packs more punch than what people realize. I don't think that lenders are always great at doing math to articulate what that could mean. So instead of negotiating $5,000 or $10,000 off of a list price, negotiating that towards discount points that improve your monthly cash flow, or help your budget. If you're budgeting X for a mortgage payment and you're able to get that down. So it is a big one. And I think it's underutilized. Even still with a lower rate environment, I think that there's still some wiggle room there and some potential benefits.
Yeah, and I think it's really important you have a good lender. I think that is overlooked. I think just sometimes like a realtor is overlooked. Who you have as your lender is important too, because they're the ones that are supposed to walk you through the process. They're the ones that are supposed to work with us on the offer. Like, hey, instead of offering 10,000 off, why don't we have them, buy a seller buy down, because this is going to work for their situation. Because what people don't understand is your lender, like, we're totally out of that part, right? Like, we don't really know anything that's going on the lending side, as far as what the conversations you have with your lender, the payments you're going to have, like, that's all between you and your lender. And a good lender gives you really good advice, and a regular lender really doesn't. They just tell you, okay, if you take this much out, this is your monthly payment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that's like a really important element that I actually didn't even have when I first started now I have really good lenders that I recommend to people because I know they're going to work with them. They're going to work with me. But, you can just have I had a lender one time, and my client had boot on a 1031, and he didn't think that was an issue, and she didn't understand the tax implication. And I find out the day before we're supposed to close, and luckily the seller let us extend, because I'm like, you do realize on 30 grand in boot, you're going to pay like 10 grand in tax. She had no idea. I thought she wanted the boot. I thought, people need the money. I thought she wanted the money for something. No, the lender just had the wrong amount and just didn't care to adjust it. And, she was going to pay 10 grand in tax. So and that's kind of when I got involved. Like, I have to start, recommending lenders, because I don't want, I don't want to deal with these people. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so that stuff can really be a telltale sign, but your lender needs to, like, how we explain a deal and why you should buy it, and, all the benefits and the cost and the cash flow, your lender needs to be on it with, here's the strategic way to make the offer that fits your lending needs. Because we don't know your lending needs. We don't know your monthly bills. We don't know your monthly payments. We know how much you're pre-approved for, but we don't know if that payment actually fits in your lifestyle. So, that's why that real estate team is so important. Like a good lender, a good realtor, a good inspector, like it all just works together so that you get the correct results.
Yeah. And I always tell people, shop for a lender almost like you shop for a mortgage, or almost like you're interviewing a realtor, because it's important who you work with. Like you said, your team is so important. And even if two lenders can, they come with like the same rate, but one of them has better options or advice or long-term thinking, definitely shop for that. It's just so important. It's huge, your relationships and the practitioners that you work with.
And the worst thing you can do is work with a bank. Like, they're the worst, like Chase Bank, Wells Fargo. I mean, because you're going to get, like, I had a client work with one of them. This was a couple months ago, and it was only on their business hours. Everything got delayed. Then he went on vacation for like 4 days, and nobody else was allowed to work on the loan. So we all just had to wait for him to get back. Like, it was just ridiculous, So they're not paid commission structures in the bank the same way they are on the private side. And I think that matters because they're not as motivated to get it done. Yeah. And you want a motivated lender, because the process to get done in 30 days, it's enough time, but it's still tight. You know what I mean? So you need someone that's motivated, because every time, I swear, that I work with like Chase or Wells Fargo, we get delayed, which is fine, except if the seller doesn't allow you to, and they have a backup offer or something that they want to take, and then they can just let that fall through and move on to the next. So like, it's fine until it's not fine, like luckily on all our situations, it's been fine, but it's not always fine.
Well, and one thing I see with first-time home buyers, or really just anything on the single family side, is, FHA loans are great. The biggest thing is, little money down. Well, you can still do a 3% or 5% down conventional loan. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, then it's less restrictive on the inspection side, which is good. And then that PMI will drop off once you hit your, loan to value ratio, where with an FHA loan, you pay that private mortgage insurance for the life of the loan.
I know.
So if you're thinking of an FHA loan, that's great, but then ask your lender about, a 3 or 5% down conventional loan and do the comparison, because short term, yes, you might get in for a little less money, but long term it costs you more. So I'm not saying that FHA loans are bad and conventional loans are, the best, but if you have two loans or two offers and one's FHA and one's conventional, which one is that seller going to maybe tend to lean towards if all things else are equal? So really ask, because FHA is a great tool, don't get me wrong, but sometimes if somebody can go conventional, then that's the route you should really go.
Yeah, exactly. And your lender's supposed to explain these things to you. So if they're not, then you need to find a different lender. And I just think this is so important because so many times, as a realtor, we can be strategic, but we need your lender's buy-in to help us be strategic because they're the ones that have every exact number with your situation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important.
So the third one is closing costs. So closing costs are negotiable. They're typically kind of split between the buyer and the seller. I know a lot of buyers were paying them in 2020 because why not? Because they were, there was 8 offers on a house. So of course you're going to have the buyer pay the closing costs in a lot of situations. Are you having a lot of your clients pay closing costs right now?
In our area, it's pretty customary for, the seller will pay their closing costs as far as like satisfaction recording, their title fees, and all of those sorts of things, with buyers paying that. Where we get into like seller paid closing costs would be like, a flat amount or, the money down, so to speak, versus like the actual title fees. So that's actually an interesting conversation. It's like, well, I want the seller to pay the closing costs. It's like, okay, let's have that conversation. What do you think are closing costs? Because some people think like commission and, mortgage registry tax and all of these things are outside of closing costs, and some people lump them in. So there's this big cloud of closing costs and what all is included in that. So, how do you explain that to your buyers? What do you see in your area?
Well, here's what I'm seeing. I actually don't really negotiate closing costs. I usually keep it 50-50. And here's why. I'm more aggressive on my offers. So I would rather have an aggressive offer with fair terms than an aggressive offer with unfair terms, because there's this line where if you're too aggressive, you just get the deal rejected, right? Like the seller's got to feel like they're winning in some capacity. And I'm so aggressive on the price that I don't negotiate the other things. In fact, I say, we're going to be easy peasy on the inspection as long as there's no big issues, because there's 2 strategies. You can offer a more, I don't want to call it, but like a price that's closer to what they want. And you can negotiate hard on the closing costs and you can negotiate hard on the inspection. In my mind, the problem with that is now my buyer's invested in the inspection and invested in the appraisal, and then the offer is going to get turned down and they're going to be out $1,000. Okay. I would rather be aggressive on the price going in, knowing with my buyer, listen, we told them we're not nickel and diming this inspection unless there's a big issue. We're not. And then if there's a big issue, we do. But if not, we just have a great price, And so for me, that's my route. Like I just had a deal close. We negotiated 10% off, which was awesome because the price was already priced to sell. It just hadn't went on the market yet. And she was all cash and that made it easy. But, we said we wouldn't nickel and dime the inspection. And it took them a lot to swallow the $10,000 price or the 10% price cut. I mean, it was $100,000. It was on $1 million property. So it was a lot to swallow that, but they did, knowing we were going to be easy. So it just depends on your strategy. But I feel like this is not, in my opinion, a market where the buyer can demand everything they want and get it.
Yeah.
It's a market where the buyer can demand some things and get a really good deal. And you need to be careful on what all you're demanding. Like, does it matter? Like, does $2,000 in closing costs, is that really, because here it is, that's what it is. It's a couple grand, right? That you might save 2, maybe $3,000. Okay. So I would rather try to get 10% off the purchase price than shuffle over $3,000.
Yeah. Which makes total sense. And if you take like, let's just say that $900,000 offer that says, hey, we're not going to nickel and dime you on the inspection versus a $925,000 offer or 950, but then they're asking for closing costs and they're asking for, really relying on that inspection to use that as a tool to price reduce. It's like, which thing is more of a sure thing in that seller's mind? And I would take that 900 all day long.
Yeah. And that's how I look at it, but you just have to be careful as a buyer right now. You want to ask for what you want to ask. You want to ask for a deal. Like I am hardcore on that, but you really got to be careful on the terms you're putting in there because think about if you were selling. The seller wants to feel like they're getting a win, okay? If you're just raking them and you're like, I want 10% off, I want my closing costs paid for, and I'm going to come up with more things on the inspection because it better be perfect when I move in, like they're just going to say no. I mean, unless they're desperate, they're just going to say no. So you have to say, this is what I want. I'm going to split the closing costs with you and I'm going to be easy peasy on the inspection. So take it or leave it and then just leave it at that, right? And that's it. That for me, I think that that's the right way to do it because if the seller doesn't feel like they're winning, they're going to say no unless they're desperate.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm all for having buyers, or working on behalf of my buyers to negotiate a deal. And you don't want to come with an offer that's so low, that's repulsive to the seller, but looking at the other data and then making your offer accordingly, where maybe it's a little bit of a deal, or maybe we think that's where fair market is, but it's still, let's just say 10% off list. It's so important to be like, here's why we're offering what we're offering. We have great terms, or we have the market data that back it up, so you can give that listing agent tools to talk to their sellers, because sometimes sellers just have a number in their head for no reason.
Yeah. And I think too, it's a really good, I really think as a buyer right now, your better strategy is to come in with the price that you want and not expect to get it on the inspection. Like I really do. Like unless because granted, you might come up with $5,000 on the inspection that you want credited, and they might tell you to pound sand. And if they tell you to pound sand, you paid $1,000 to get all of the things done, right? And it's just not a great, in my personal opinion, it's not a great way to go about it, right? Like even from the seller side, like I've had offers and I, tell people, we'll take this offer, but don't nickel and dime my client on the inspection because they're not going to do it, right? Like just so you know, like I talk to them and they do not, unless there's a big issue, and I prepare them because I also don't want a house to go under contract for whatever amount and then to take another 5 or 10 grand off. I mean, so unless there's a big issue. So in my mind, it's like nobody wants to go under contract either direction and not make the deal work because it's a pain for both parties. So just be upfront at the beginning and, get the price you want at the beginning and then just absorb, unless you find something major, $2,000 or $3,000 worth of handyman work. I mean, that's just that's part of moving into a house, in my opinion.
Yeah. Especially to get it up to your specs. But I would say in our area, there's a couple of main things that get negotiated. Even if we say we're not going to nickel and dime on the inspection, the things that I do see being negotiated are septic systems. If we don't have a compliance certificate for that, sewer scopes. A lot of cities are requiring sewer line scopes, and to repair that might be 5,000 to 10,000. We're kind of seeing that be the range. And then radon mitigation systems, a colorless, odorless gas that's found in the Midwest. Those are, $1,500 to $2,000. Those couple things sort of fall outside of the, hey, we're not going to nickel and dime you. Those are like health and safety items. But beyond that, it's like creaky cupboard door. No, we're not asking for that.
Exactly. Like big things.
All of that off the list.
Yep. Like big things. Like my client, I just sold her home. She had PB plumbing, right? And so that plumbing, not good. So, those things have to be addressed. That's not really, and if you're going to address them, it's, that you do address them, right? But I think that, creaky cupboard doors, a dripping faucet, a minor leak in the faucet, like those are all so silly. Like those are all a handyman, $60 an hour can fix that in 20 minutes. Like, you know what I mean? So like, like you have to kind of add up all the handyman work and say, and I do that too, by the way. I take everything they want. I submit it to my handyman. I say approximately how many hours of work is this? He's usually like 7 or 8 times 60. Okay. It's like $500. You know what I mean? It's just like, that's just how you do it. Right. And that's the kind of stuff that is just going to irritate your seller. So you should really just absorb it and call it a
Yeah.
day. Because here's the other thing too. You might need their compliance, right? Like, so I had this lady, we were buying this house from her, my client and I, and there was like $500 or $600 in handyman work. Like, we gauged it all out. And I said to my client, do you want to ask for this? You know, I don't recommend it, but do you want? And she said, no, it's okay. Well, guess what? We had to turn around to that same lady and ask her for an extension, because this was the one with the boot issue, right? And she gave us a week extension. Well, guess what? You nickel and dime. She could nickel and dime. You know, you want to be difficult over little things. You gotta really watch it, because this is you don't know when you're going to be asking a favor.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is like, it seems like common sense, but when you get wrapped up in the negotiating, you know, some people can be sticklers over the littlest things. So I think it's important to like keep the big picture in mind. It's like, do I want to lose this house or have a rougher transaction for $500 on a, you know, $300,000 or $600,000 house? You know?
Yeah, as a buyer, you don't want to be too cocky, right? Like, you feel like you hold all the cards, and you do hold a lot of them right now, but you don't hold all of them. And also in the transaction, you don't know what's going to go sideways, where you're going to need more time, or you're going to need a favor, or you're going to need something. And you really just want to be on good terms with the seller, you know, as much as you can be, because you need them as much as they need you, you know? So you just have to remember that.
Which sort of brings us to our last point of timing in terms.
Yep.
So that is a big one that goes into negotiations, and I think it's totally underrated. You know, we don't know where that seller's going to go next or what their next steps are. So, you know, maybe they're negotiating a rent back, or maybe we, you know, push out the closing a little bit longer to make it easier for them, so they don't have to find, you know, a rental in between for a month. And that might be more advantageous or important to them than the maximum price. So it's a question I ask almost immediately is, besides price, what terms are important to seller? Do they have a preferred closing date? Like, those are all things that a good agent will do to find out what the seller's hoping for on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do have more flexibility. You know, people are just taking contingent offers right now. Now, if you do a contingent offer, you're probably not going to get as good of a price accepted, just because you do have a contingency. But I know a lot of times on 1031s, this is awesome, because then, you know, I'm going to be doing a 1031 in the spring, and it's like, I'm already identifying properties I want to go see. I'm already going to see if we can do a contingent once I get mine listed, because for me, it gives me more time. Like, 2020 was so hard to do a 1031, because if you sold something, you could sell it in probably a day, but then you have to then buy something without overpaying when you have 8 people bidding on a house, and you have to drop your whole life to go look at places, right? And you only have 45 days. So you might eventually just have to overbid someone just to get it, right? So that's not really ideal 1031 timing. Now,
it's almost like you have PTSD from the 2021 market.
You do, right? I do, I think. You know, I was like, I can't do a 1030. Everyone's like, don't you wish you would have sold this, you know, 2 years ago? I'm like, well, yeah, for the price I could have got, but then I'd have to turn around and buy something in the same market if I'm 1031ing it. So like, not really. Like, you know, at least now I can know my exit, and then I can negotiate the next thing I get into. Before, you would figure out your exit and you just pray to God you could get something without overpaying for it. And I think a lot of people were. So it's like, I could have got an extra $30,000 over here maybe, but then how much would this cost me? Because now I feel like I'm buying something more expensive. So I think I can get even a bigger like discount than I could have gotten, you know? So
when it all boils down, you're probably getting a better deal or a better trade now than you would have in 21.
I think so. Even with the lower sale price, because it's not all about the sale price, you know? And plus, like you were saying, like the terms, like, you know, I can do a longer close to give me more time as a seller. You know, I could, you know, if it works for the buyer, I can, you know, make a contingent offer. I can, you know, there's just more flexibility. You know, the buyers can even do longer closes. You know, there's so much leverage in that, especially too, if you have cash, then like if you're a buyer with cash right now, like you have a ton of leverage. That's how I got that 10% discount. I don't think that would have been as good of a discount if she needed financing.
Yeah. Well, and it really depends on the type of property too. I mean, if it's a large property, people have a lot to move. You know, I have an acreage right now that's really nice acreage, but there's multiple outbuildings and, you know, implements and things to sell. And the buyers don't want to move in the winter here either. So it's like, do you think that the sellers would be open to closing in April? And this is the question they're asking in December. And I was like, yes, they would love that. And they're like, great, us too. We don't want to move our animals and everything. So 4 or 5 months out, we're planning this closing. It's under contract. Everybody can, make plans for next steps, but we're just waiting to close, with decent weather, better timing, time to shuffle all of the personal property, and it's great for both parties. So
yeah, and as a buyer, you can really negotiate. Like if you want to move at a certain time, you might be able to negotiate that in. And even as the one we just bought in that we just closed on, he wanted to close before the end of the year because of a tax issue, the seller. So, if you can make that happen, that was also part of our negotiation to get that 10% off because he wanted to close before the end of the year. We made the offer like end of November and we're able to close by end of December. So, I mean, it's just one of those things where you have to see what's important to them and play into that, and that can help you get a better deal as well.
Yeah, which I had two closings yesterday for those reasons. It's like, let's squeak them in before the end of the year, like make sure it gets all done.
Yep. And some people might want it done before the end of the year. Some people might not want it done this year because maybe they have a big tax hit this year and they want to get it done next year, So,
for sure.
You just never know, but you have to be willing to kind of negotiate that in, And I just think buyers right now, like, don't be sitting on the sidelines. Oh, it's such a good time to buy. Like, I was just talking to my lender the other day and I go, I have these 3 first-time home buyers, been working with them for a year. Nobody's bought anything. The market was so much better in Arizona, at least in the Phoenix area, to buy early this year. Right. And so now we're in the next year and, they're just afraid to pull the trigger. And it's such a good buyer's market. It's still a good buyer's market. It might not get better. Trump gets his new person in May. They're talking about doing a 50-year mortgage, which I know people hate, but it's gonna stimulate the market. They're considering doing some kind of, expanding like loan assumptions. All these things sound awesome, and I get it. But if you are a first-time buyer, that is all stuff that makes prices go up. So you just be careful waiting too long because you might miss it. We might be in the housing recession right now and you just you think it's going to get worse because everyone thinks it's got to be '08 again. And Ken and I were saying on our show yesterday, it's interesting. He goes, people that have the same income brackets tend to hang out together, right? So a lot of people are saying, I can't afford to buy a house and none of my friends can afford to buy a house and none of my family members can afford to buy a house and nobody I know can afford to buy a house. So nobody can afford to buy a house. But the truth is there's a lot of people that can afford to buy houses right now, whether it's their parents have money and they're helping them buy it or they themselves have money. It doesn't really matter, but there are buyers out there, right? There are buyers. We don't have a lack of buyers right now. Everyone's kind of just on the sidelines, but people are starting to come off the sidelines. And that's what we're seeing. Like, oh, rates are down a little bit. Oh, Trump's person's going to be in there. I feel like next year is going to be better in the market. I should get in now. And so just because you and nobody can afford to buy a house, you have to be careful with that thinking.
But you have, like you said, that's a good point because if that's who you hang out with and that's what you hear, then you start to believe it. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, I can't afford to buy a house, but have you talked to a lender? Have you talked to a realtor? Have you gone down the path of really exploring whether it is or isn't an option for you? Like, maybe yep, I lost my job, I can't get financing. But if you haven't, you have, steady income, that where you're going to live, like really talk to somebody because it might be a stretch, but maybe it won't be.
Yeah.
You don't know until you actually explore. So it's just super important to do that.
Well, and something else that's interesting to me is everyone complains about this 50-year mortgage and there's no way they would do it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I just saw on an article I was reading, they're coming out with 100-month car loans. So now they're extending the car loan. I know, right? But I guess my point is that that's what they're doing. They're extending these kind of loans so that people can afford it. Now, of course, what does that do to car prices? Well, if you can finance it over 100 months, it's going to make car prices go up because over time there's going to be more demand because people now can afford it. I mean, that's just what happens. And a lot of pushback on this 50-year mortgage is the same pushback the 30-year mortgage got when it came out. And so, and there is a 50-year mortgage in Canada, and there is a 50-year mortgage in Japan, and there is a 50-year mortgage in Australia. So it's not unheard of to have this. And I don't disagree that it's not financing it for too long, but I also agree with the fact that it's better than just renting forever.
Yep. And I think what we've talked about before is people typically don't keep their houses for 50 years. It's just a financing tool. Even the 30-year mortgage, a lot of people don't keep their house for 30 years, but it's a way to establish ownership, build equity, and, move your financial future forward versus, throwing away money and renting. There's a time and place for renting, but these tools are there for a reason.
Well, and it's interesting you said that because realistically in the US now, you can do a 15, you can do a 30. Almost everybody does a 30. Nobody keeps their house for 30 years. So why don't they do a 15?
Yeah.
Because the payment's more.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of how it's going to be in the 50. It's like the payment will be less.
Yep.
Yes, you're not going to keep your house for as long, for 50 years probably. And, and you can always pay more on it. You can always put more down. You can always refinance it later. There's a lot of things you can always do. But the problem is right now is getting those first time home buyers in housing. And it's just going to be the easiest way. And actually my lender was saying they're already discussing how they would, structure kind of a 50-year internally, right, with their teams, thinking that is what's going to come out. So they're already thinking that's what's going to come out. Now, I don't know what kind of, information that they have, but my point is like that's definitely on the docket for next year. And I did hear Trump said he wants to come out with something big with housing reform next year, like a big, Trump likes his big announcement. So a big announcement.
Yep.
And I think if I'm guessing, it's going to be the 50-year. What do you think?
I'm thinking the same thing. He likes to go big, and this would be a big, huge, significant change in the real estate industry for people to establish home ownership, which he's a real estate guy. So, I think that that's in the cards for him, which if he does it, I think it would be great.
Yeah. I mean, for those that choose, you don't have to do it. So for those that choose to do it, I think a lot of people will still go towards the 30, but I think a lot of your first time buyers, it'll help them get in at the 50.
And I've even, going back to the 15-year mortgage, I've had a couple of clients that are adamant on a 15-year mortgage. They see Dave Ramsey and some of these other financial, that are a little more conservative, which is not a bad thing, but they lock themselves into a 15-year mortgage. And I said, okay, what happens when a couple of things break and, you have unexpected life choices, or if you plan on having kids or whatever, where more of your income is going to be, required to live. So I said, instead of being tied to that 15-year mortgage payment, how about you still do a 20 or 30-year loan, make the payment like you had a 15-year mortgage, but then you have a little wiggle room where if you have to go down a little bit a month to your, normal payment, you still can. There's no prepayment penalty on a 20 or 30-year mortgage.
Yep.
So why push so hard and lock yourself into a 15? You can still make that payment. But, I just remind people of that before they do a 15-year mortgage. And if they say, no, I won't pay extra unless I'm required to, it's like, okay, you do you.
Yeah.
But it's just think real hard before you do it, know the pros and cons, and then, make your decisions accordingly. But
absolutely.
Yeah,
all right. Well, we will see you guys next week. Have a great New Year's and see you in 2026.
See you next year.